Well, good evening, friends. So at the beginning, we started with a change, beginning with the precepts, a variant of the precepts for our specifically set up for our Sangha meetings. So I thought it would be good to talk about what the precepts are, why we would engage in them at all, and how they're appropriate for framing how we are in our Sangha meetings. So the Buddha, in his teachings, he said, "I teach suffering and the end of suffering," and he presented it with through the Four Noble Truths. And the fourth noble truth is the Eightfold Path, which most of you are probably already familiar with. The Eightfold Path is the prescription that the Buddha gave to end suffering. So the first noble truth is that we suffer, that we have stress in our lives, that this is part of this conditioned world that we live in. And the second noble truth is that the root of that suffering is because when things come into our life, we cling to them, we grab them and hold them and cling to them. And we do that either by reaching out to pull them in because we want them, or by reaching out, grabbing them to try to push them away. And the third noble truth, the Buddha said, but it doesn't have to be that way. There is a way to live in a way that's free from this process. And so the fourth noble truth then is the Eightfold Path, which was the Buddha's prescription for how to live this way. And then further, when we look at the Eightfold Path, it can be divided into three different areas. There's an area on ethical living, Sila. There's an area on paying attention the right way, concentration, mindfulness, samadhi. And then the third part of the path is panya, or wisdom. And these sort of grow out of each other. So with ethical behavior, which is what we'll be talking about tonight, out of that grows the capacity to really be present, to really pay attention, to concentrate, and to develop mindfulness, mindful awareness. And then when we live that way, when we're living from that place of mindful awareness, wisdom naturally arises. It grows out of that because of the way that we're meeting our lives and the world around us. So it sort of starts with this process of Sila, or ethical living, and moves to those other levels. So it's the foundation out of which the freedom that the Buddha talked about there being the possibility of in our lives. It's the foundation out of which that comes. And so we'll talk about what ethical living is in the context of Buddhism. But if you think about it for a minute, if you're not living in an ethical way, trying to concentrate or be mindful could be really challenging, right? If you're fighting with others, if you're running from the law because you're stealing things, or all the types of things that we think of as unskillful living, it's pretty hard to pay attention in the way that the Buddha talked about, this idea of samadhi, or focused concentration and mindful awareness. So that gives the foundation for when the Buddha talked about ethical living, that puts it in a different place than what many of us know as ethics or morality. I know when I first came across ethics in Buddhism, I had a rejection to it. I didn't want to hear about that. And the reason was because in my own experience upbringing, I was taught that there was good and there was bad. And given in my own particular upbringing a lot of sources of guilt, I was bad in many ways. I'm a kid, but I was bad. And so that was sort of ingrained in me, this idea of good and bad. And furthermore, it didn't make sense to me why the law that I was supposed to be following, especially the canon law. I was raised Catholic, so I couldn't eat meat on Friday. I didn't get it. I could not understand what could be wrong with eating meat on Friday. How could I be doomed eternally to hell for eating meat on Friday? It made no sense to me. So I kind of rejected that idea of good and bad from that sense that it was taught to me. And so when I looked a little deeper into the Buddha's message about morality, I was intrigued because he didn't talk about it as being good and bad. he talked about it as being skillful and unskillful. And so ethical behavior is rooted in skillful intentionality. And what that says is when we're living from that place of an ethical intentionality, the kinds of outcomes that happen in our life tend to be the kinds of outcomes that we seek. Well, now I could see very clearly that this made more sense to me. It's due to cause and effect. If you live a certain way, you can expect certain kinds of outcomes. If you live a different kind of way, you can expect other outcomes. Which outcomes do you seek? So you have to take that bigger picture to say, well, this is the kind of life I seek. This is the kind of relationships I want to have in my life. So this makes sense for me to live this way. And so the idea of Sila, or the Buddhist sense of ethics, really resonated with me once I saw that it didn't mean that I was doomed to hell or going to heaven. It was not about some afterlife or some conditions in the future, that I had to sacrifice how to live now for that. It was about the outcomes that I sought right now. And so the way that I choose to live my life, the way that we choose to live our lives, very much impacts what happens to us tomorrow, next week, next year, and for the rest of our lives. So with that foundation of ethics, I was very much interested in looking for ways to bring it into my own personal life. And it made a lot of sense to me as to why it would be such a core part of the Buddha's teachings. So in the Eightfold Path, Sila has 3 of the 8 steps of the path that are part of that process, part of that division of the Eightfold Path. And they include an ethical livelihood, right actions or ethical actions, and right livelihood, right actions, and I'm drawing a blank right now. Speech. What is it? Speech. Thank you. A big one. Thank you so much. It's like, that's not a good one to forget. Yeah. So those 3 embody what the Buddha talked about as ethical living, and when they were presented to the bhikkhus, the monks, the community of monastics that the Buddha worked with, they were given as a series of precepts, of agreements that were made by the monk to the monastery that they lived in. And over the years, those grew and grew. There was just a few at the beginning, the way the stories go. But later on, there's actually now 228 or something that monastics live by these different precepts. And they cover everything from what are you allowed to possess, or an alms bowl and a robe and a toothbrush and things like that, to the way you actually live your life. As householders, we're only given 5 of these precepts to work with, and the way they are presented in the discourses, which are the suttas, or the recordings, when they were finally recorded of what the Buddha's teachings were, they are things to not do. So the first of the precepts is to not bring harm to others, don't kill. The second is to not steal, don't take what's not freely offered. The third is to avoid, is presented in the suttas as sexual misconduct, but it applies to all of our sense desires. This urge that we have to satisfy all of our senses, to not focus on that. The fourth one is speech. Don't use wrongful speech. Don't use harsh speech. Don't use angry speech. And the fifth one is to avoid intoxicants. So as I was working with these myself, I realized, well, there's a counterpoint to each. And then I found many teachers who talk about there's a negative side, but there's also a positive aspect to each of these. So if we think of the first one of not doing harm to ourselves or others, the positive side of that is to cultivate kindness. Through practices of metta or loving kindness, and other practices that we can do to not just not harm others, but to cultivate a space that is kind and generous to others. For me, that positive aspect, I'd rather go towards the positive than just shun or avoid the negative. So that's very helpful for me to have the positive aspects. For not stealing, what I came up with for myself is there's two parts that there's to not take what's not freely offered. Then the second part for me is to honor what is freely offered. So don't reject something if somebody offers you something. I mean, you're giving them a gift if you accept what they've offered you. So I felt that's part of it. So to not take what's not freely offered, to honor what is freely offered, and then to cultivate generosity for others, so that our hearts begin to open, so that we can then offer freely to others, whether it's material help or possessions, whether it's our kindness, our intentions to support people in different ways. There's a lot we can do just around that second precept. The third precept of not cultivating, or of not feeding our sense desires is to cultivate moderation. The positive side is to cultivate moderation in our sense desires. And I know for me, it's like when I started looking at it as just my sense desires, there's a lot of different aspects of sense desires that I would like to not take. I'd like to take more of than is right. Whether it's food or whatever it happens to be, I can see myself. I have a greedy personality, and that type of personality does want more of these things. It was very helpful for me to see that cultivating moderation in all my sense desires was a good tool to work with. That idea of a greedy personality, there's talk in the teachings of three different personality types. There's the greedy type that wants more of everything, the aversive type which pushes things away, and the deluded type that just doesn't know. One of our teachers who comes here from time to time, Amita, was at our house prior to one of the retreats, and we were just talking about it. She and Lori, my wife, were talking about it, and I walked into the kitchen, and Amita said, "John, do you think you're a greedy type, or an aversive type, or a deluded type?" And I thought for a minute. I said, "I think I'm all three." And she said, "That's the greedy type." So I got confirmation from Amita that greedy type. So looking at our sense desires and seeing, well, what kind of personality do we have, can be helpful then for us to begin to look at these sense desires that we have, and how do we bring them out and cultivate moderation in those sense desires. Right speech is a huge one. The Buddha talked many, many times in many of his discourses about our speech. And skillful speech has a few different elements to it. The first is that it's truthful, only speaking the truth, but that truth needs to be timely. Just because something is true doesn't mean we say it. It can be hurtful to say something that's true. So timely and appropriate. If we have something to say, it needs to be truthful, timely, and appropriate. That we avoid harsh or unkind speech. Those things, they might even feel true to you as you're saying them, but they can be hurtful just in the way we say them. The big one for me was idle chatter. To avoid idle chatter. I mean, my gosh, how much of our lives are spent in just idle chatter? Joseph Goldstein, who's a teacher in this Western Theravada tradition, said that at Insight Meditation Society, he and some of the other teachers decided to see, can we just get rid of idle chatter for a while? Can we just not use that? He said they didn't talk. He said they decided almost everything they were talking about was idle chatter. So avoiding harsh, angry speech, avoiding idle chatter, avoiding backbiting and gossiping. This is a big one for us. And oftentimes we're very sophisticated in thinking, oh, that's not really backbiting. I'm just sharing something that's going on. So we actually can bring harm to others. And you can see this probably in people have told you something about somebody who's not present, and how your opinion of that person can change just by what you've heard, even though you didn't see it or know of it yourself, just by hearing that. So that idea of of avoiding backbiting and gossiping is a key part of right speech. And then the positive side of cultivating a kindly tongue, so that instead of finding the harsh things to say, could we find good things to say? And if we can't, to say nothing. I had a customer of mine that I worked with for many years. He worked up on the North Slope of Alaska in the oil fields up there. And so we'd be on the phone often to talk about things. And it never failed. Anytime he brought up somebody's name, he would say something good about the person. So he'd say, you know, the operator Joe out in this plant, who works the board out there, he's really good at something or other. He would always put those little phrases in about it. So I didn't know these people, but I felt good about them just because of his kind words about them. And it wasn't a big thing, but it was really, and it made me feel good about my friend Dave, who was the guy I was talking to, because, you know, you felt like, well, this is what Dave says about me when I'm not there, right? It's kind things. So that idea that you can find things that are kind, and then just the very act of looking for those things. When you come across or meet somebody or see somebody, what's something that I can think of that's kind about that person or something out of them? So we can do that, and because speech is such a big thing, it's worth spending some time on that. The last of the precepts is to avoid intoxicants, and this is often talked about as primarily alcohol or drugs. But if you think about it, there's many things that can intoxicate us. Television, YouTube, the internet in general can intoxicate us, right? You can find you've become, you spend a few hours doing almost anything, you can find you've become intoxicated by it. And the reason I think that the Buddha talked about avoiding intoxicants is because when we are intoxicated to any level, we're not present. We're no longer mindful. So I think the positive aspect of not becoming intoxicated or not indulging in intoxicants is cultivating mindful awareness. So the moments that we're spending where we're not intoxicated by whatever it happens to be, doesn't have to be drink, but by even our own thoughts can intoxicate us. But when we're not intoxicated by that, we have the opportunity to be really present to what's going on. When I first learned about these precepts, and one of the things that we'll talk a little bit about is on retreats. If you've ever been on one of these kinds of retreats, many of them start by taking these precepts for the days or weeks that you're together. I remember I was working on the precepts because I had taken them at the beginning of the retreat, and I'm thinking to myself, you know, I'm in pretty good shape on these things. I don't kill anything, you know. I try to shoo bugs away or put them outside. Mosquitoes, I probably need to work on those because I do swat them. I don't steal. I'm a pretty honest guy. I don't really steal anything. Intoxicant or my sense desires, I could do some work there because I can see places where my greedy type wants more than what's probably best for me. Skillful speech, I'm pretty good with speech. Probably my big one is I exaggerate a lot. If 3 is good, 4 is better, 5's even better yet. So I would tend to exaggerate things. The problem with exaggerating is you believe, if it's 3 and you exaggerate to 4, now you believe 4 was the number, so you get to go to 5 next time, right? So things get big. But I could see that was one of my tendencies, was to do that. So I could see I needed some speech, and then I didn't drink, I don't do drugs, so I don't have to talk. So I got this down. And as I started thinking more about the precepts and the ways that what they really mean deeply, I realized that's not at all the case. There's lots of places to work. That idea of not bringing harm to others, there's so many ways we can bring harm to others that we may not even be aware of. So just even being aware of my actions, my behaviors, how am I touching the world around me? Am I bringing harm to other people around me? And a lot of times we don't even notice that if we're not really paying attention. So I saw that that and also cultivating kindness to others, there was lots of work that could be done in that area. And with stealing, it was the same thing. I wasn't taking things from people, but I was taking freedoms from others in some cases, whether it be in a conversation where I wouldn't wait to give them the time to finish what they were saying. I'd be planning what I was going to say while they were still talking. I'm taking their space when I do that. So the idea of and the other thing that I was notorious for was not accepting things that were offered to me. I wouldn't let people like buy me lunch or anything. And it occurred to me, that's taking something from them. It's taking from them the capacity to do kindness, to be generous. If I don't allow generosity and compassion to flow here, how can they do it? I wouldn't like it if everybody did that to me when I tried to be generous. So I was taking. So that idea of not taking expanded. And at the same time, the idea of cultivating generosity towards others. So that in addition to not taking, is how can I open my life up more to be more aware of what others need? And one of the tools that I developed for myself was trying to have the thought in my mind, if I really didn't need my mind for anything, which is the vast majority of the time, to spend some of my time just when I'd be, especially like in a restaurant or a parking lot or a store, like when I would see somebody, I'd feel to myself, what does this noble being need in this moment? And I used the language noble being in my word because noble being would transcend what the person looked like or what their actions were in the moment. Anything that could be, that I could feel resistance to, that noble essence at the core of that person is what I was looking at. And so some amazing things happened when I would do that, when I would be there. I remember one time in a Starbucks, I was in line, there was several people in front of me and people behind me, and I was waiting. I was just looking around thinking, what do any of these noble beings need anything from me? And 99% of the time it's no, they just need you to leave them alone. But right behind me is a woman, and she kept looking at her watch. And so I asked her, I said, are you in a hurry? And she said, I got my son in the car. I'm supposed to be dropping him off at soccer, but I wanted to get a coffee before I took him. And I said, why don't you go ahead of me? It's, I'm not in a hurry. I can't empty the line, but at least get close. So thank you so much. That was it. That was the end of the conversation. But the feeling inside that came out of just that little act of generosity, of just being present to what does somebody need in this moment, was very rewarding, and it felt opening to me. So doing things like that give us a capacity to spend our mind in a more open place, to being more aware of what's in the world around us. So that idea of generosity can flourish that way. I think with each of the aggregates, with each of the precepts, we can look for ways that work for us, so that we sort of make these ours and use them in our lives as a way to cultivate skillful intention. And the Buddha talked about the roots of our intention as being sort of the core of where things happen. He said our intentions lead to our behaviors. So there's an intention before there's a behavior. So if we have skillfully focused intention, then the actions that will come out of that tend to be skillful. He said there's three roots to the skillful roots of the intention. There's when we're coming out of generosity, when we're coming out of compassion, or when we're coming out of clear seeing, understanding what leads to what, cause and effect. When we see that clearly, our intentionality arising out of that tends to lead to the kinds of outcomes that we seek. So we can use that model with our precepts as a way to cultivate these qualities in our lives. What I started doing shortly after working with the precepts that way is I came up with my own phrasing for each of them, and I started saying them. I still say them just in my head several times a day. When I get up in the morning, it's one of the first things I do. When I go to bed at night, it's one of the last things I do. And several times during the day, when I don't need my mind for something else, I kind of look at my mind as times when I'm using it for something good, but then there's this huge amount of the time where it's just sort of roaming or rambling. So, and I think of it as a resource like money or anything else. How do I spend my mind? So I've chosen to spend more of my mind in these times of doing the precepts. And as I was doing that, some amazing things came out of it. Like, that's where I learned that I exaggerate. If you believe it or not, I didn't know I did that before. But by paying attention to right speech and thinking, is this truthful? Even when I was saying something, knowing for the first time, I am exaggerating this. And I'd be saying, and it's something that was exaggerated, but I would be aware of it. That was so powerful. It wasn't like, I can't say it. It wasn't like that. It was like just being aware, oh my gosh, this is, what I'm saying here is not really truthful. This is an exaggeration. Even as I'm saying it, I'm aware of it. It's like, that was so powerful to me to see, or harsh speech, or backbiting was another one, where I would be saying something, feeling like I'm just sharing and realizing this could be hurtful to the person I'm saying it about. And the more I saw that when I was talking, which came out of, I think, just saying these precepts a lot, the more I was able to sort of catch those things and catch them before I said them. Noticing when I was planning my next sentence or my next thought while somebody else was still talking. And had this idea, and I could just feel the pull to put it together and say it. I could feel that pull. And noticing, yes, this is, can I just let this be right now and just listen? And move back into spaciousness and just listen. And it was just an incredible gift to be able to do that. I don't do it all the time, believe me. But the moments that I've been able to do it, and I think they have arisen in my life from using the precepts and saying them over and over again. So I encourage you, if these work for you, to think of something like that. And you have to make them yours. Don't take the language that the Buddha has or anybody else has, but make them something that works for you. So coming to why would we bring them into our Sangha meetings, I think they're a great foundation for how to live in any kind of a setting. And when you're in community, there's a lot of close interactions that can, sometimes they can be tough. We're very fortunate in our Sangha that we don't really have much of that. But the other thing is, we can lose perspective while we're in our Sangha meeting the same way as we do in daily life. So we ring the bell, we sit, we're all present in mindfulness for some part of it. It might be a breath or two, but for some part of it, we're paying attention. Then the bell rings again and we start talking. So we might just as well be out on the street if the mind goes back to our street mind, right? If it just goes back to just, what am I going to say? That's an interesting idea that Dave had. I like that. But I think this is, if we're doing that kind of just conversation, we're not using this time to its best advantage. This time that you've given yourself, an hour and a half, is a gift you gave yourself. And it's a gift around being present, and being mindful, and staying introspective and here. So I always call it, it's like a meditative laboratory this time when we're talking with each other, to use it that way. So the primary focus during that time should be one of introspection, to see if somebody says something, what's going on in me when they say it? What's happening in me? Not getting caught in the story of, I agree, I disagree, or I have to make this point, but what's actually arising in me when I hear that? So that we can begin to see the mechanism out of which we're coming. We can't do that for the most part in our daily life out in the street, right? Because you're so busy in a conversation, you have to, respond the way it's appropriate to do out on the street. Here, you don't have to. I remember when I started with this group many, many years ago, back in the 90s, there was a meeting, the Thursday night meeting, and there had been a situation where there was a woman in our Sangha who was in the hospital. And Paul Gelman, who started this group, had bought flowers and said they're from the Sangha. And then in the meeting, he asked if anybody wanted to donate to this group, to this fee that we had to spend on the flowers. And the group was very quiet. And then one woman said, I'm quite angry with you, Paul. I feel, and she started explaining how she felt that Paul had overstepped his boundary by spending money for the group. But just the beautiful way she expressed it, you could tell she wasn't speaking from her anger. She was reflecting that she was feeling anger. And then it was quiet. And I'm like, is anything? And then I'm waiting for Paul. And Paul responded, I can see that. I forget her name. I could see why you would be angry with that. I apologize to you and to anybody else who feels that was overstepping a boundary there to do that. I didn't mean to bring any. It was just such a beautiful interaction of a conversation that normally would be loud or could be hurtful to people. So I could see that it's possible to use this time that we're together in conversation, in dialogue, in discussion, as our workshop, and that was a perfect example of that. So in terms of setting the stage for that, that's why we have decided that and in boundaries, which again, we're pretty good on the boundaries here, but for people who may float through or join us later, why we decided to put together the precepts the way that we have. So I want to just read them over again, and you can just, as you hear them, just think about, from the perspective of the Buddhist idea of Sila, how these might fit for you. Because what we're asking in the beginning, we ask you to listen and agree in your heart to honor them while we're here in community together. So we're not asking you to change your life, we're not asking you to buy into the precepts in your everyday life, but just for the hour and a half that we're together, to honor these, to help build our community. So each of these 5, I've rewritten a little bit here. The first is, we undertake the precept of not harming others. We're creating a safe space for each person through our actions, judgments, speech, and behaviors. We do not offer advice or try to solve others' problems. So that offering advice and solving problems is something we do for friends in our street life, right, in our community outside of here. But when somebody's sharing something here, right, to keep it in terms of the Dharma, even though we feel the pull to fix their problem or to offer some advice, the goal here is not to do that. We're not trying to do that. Instead, you might, if something comes up for you, and you do have some similar experience, you could say something like, well, I had that in my own life one time, and this is what I did. So you could still be sharing something that might be helpful to the person, but we should be doing this. So this is the idea of not harming others in our Sangha. The second one, we undertake the precept of not taking that which is not freely offered. We respect the community space, giving all a chance to speak and to be heard. We respect silence during the meditations and do not disturb others with our movements. So a couple of things around this. Many of us, especially guys, are pretty good at speaking their mind and doing it pretty early on in conversations. There's others who need time to be able to speak. They need enough space to feel like, okay, it's open, it's an opportunity now for me to speak. So giving that space, which would not be comfortable out on the street, right? I mean, how long can you go out on the street with nobody talking? 4 or 5 seconds and everybody starts to feel uncomfortable. We could go 20 minutes here. We could go there's been times we've gone the whole time, nobody said anything. So it's possible to give that time for others to be able to speak. And then we respect silence during the meditations, which again, we're good at these things. This is not remedial, it's just bringing it to mind. And don't disturb others with our movements. So if you happen to arrive late, it's coming in quietly and sitting down. And, so just being aware that what we do during that time can impact others sitting. The third is we undertake the precept of moderation of our desires. And this one, again, gets to how do we use our time to monitor what desires are arising in us. Paying attention to what arises in us around the urge to speak, the desire to be right. This is often a big one for us. Is, if I have something and I say it, and somebody says something that could at all be taken as, adversarial to it, I feel the need to defend it, right? So paying attention to that, how that arises in me. The pull to appear important. A lot of times when we're talking or saying something, there's some feeling that it's I feel more reified, my sense of self feels stronger when I was able to get my point across and drive it home. So just noticing those things. So we speak and act from the skillful intentions that we talked about: generosity, compassion, and clear seeing. The fourth one, we undertake the precept of right speech. We keep our speech focused on the Dharma and speak only from our own experience. So not what we've heard, not what we've read, this is what's my experience with it. Doesn't mean you don't bring up something you read. That's not what we're saying. But what's really valuable, if you think of what's valuable to you, is when we hear about each other's experience, when we hear about our own humanity, because we share that. My weaknesses, I feel, they feel, what's the right word? They feel validated, I guess, when I see that others share those same weaknesses, those same foibles, those same frailties. We avoid harsh speech and idle chatter during our time together. We give space for all to share. And then the last one, we undertake the precept of avoiding intoxicating actions and behaviors. So we're not drinking or doing drugs here or watching YouTube or anything. But that idea of cultivating mindful awareness throughout the Sangha time and using the discussion period as a time of introspective reflection rather than feeding our desires. So that's a big one. So can I use that time to pay attention to what's going on in me instead of satisfying the need to have to say something? I suspect if we all did that, we'd have a pretty quiet group for a while, if you're not trying to satisfy that drive within yourself. So, and then the last part of that is we pay attention when others are sharing. So instead of, as I was sharing some of my own experience of planning what I was going to say and my diatribe that was to come, to let that go when we see that that's what we're doing and really listening to the other, sort of opening ourselves to the other. So that's the intention of these precepts. And so the plan is that at the beginning of each Sangha meeting, we'll start with these. Whoever's leading the group will read these. And then we just ask again that you listen and agree in your heart to honor them while we're here.